as we get right into the meat of the show, because there is so much to get into in this Clemson-Ohio State game. It was an instant classic. It was one of those deals where for years I have been staunchly against expanding the playoff because for the most part, most seasons, there's one or two teams that are clearly better than everybody else. Last year, Alabama and Clemson were clearly better than everybody else. We didn't need more playoff teams to determine who the two best teams were. But this was the year where it felt like, okay, there are three teams that have really separated themselves. LSU in the SEC, Ohio State in the Big Ten, and Clemson in the ACC. And it really felt like the Clemson-Ohio State game might line up as though it was going to be an all-time classic, and it absolutely was. You all watched it Saturday night with me, and unfortunately, like so many sporting events over the last couple of years, we see it all the time in college basketball. It actually happened a little bit with the Kentucky-Louisville game, certainly the Kentucky-Ohio State game last week where the refs kind of took over. The refs became part of the story. It's happened in the NFL with Saints-Rams, and I actually think there's a kind of a cool parallel between Saints-Rams and Ohio State-Clemson. But the refs became a huge part of this story and a huge part of this game. And it's so disappointing because it took away from what was an awesome game, and it took away from a game in which I actually thought Clemson was the better team. Clemson was the more deserving team. Clemson was the team that should have won that game. But let's get into it play-by-play, not literally play-by-play, but there were three big plays I thought that completely swung that game. But to understand the three plays that led to kind of this controversial finish, if you will, you got to understand how the game started, and that was with Ohio State completely dominating this game. And I know you all watched it, so you don't need me to go through all the details of it, but Ohio State jumped out to a 10-0 lead after the first quarter, a 16-0 lead midway through the second quarter, and it should have been even more. It should have been about 21-0. Ohio State had plenty of chances early in the game to capitalize, to take advantage, to put extra points on the board. Certainly not pinning it on one player, but J.K. Dobbins actually had a J.K. Dobbins is the Ohio State running back. He had a drop touchdown in the end zone. That was originally called a touchdown, but we kind of saw in video replay that it was after review, not a catch. And then later, a later drive, he had a drop on a screen pass that would have gone for a touchdown. Really should have been 2 touchdowns. Ohio State had to settle for 3 field goals overall in the first half on what could have been touchdown drives. And as I said, they were up 16-0, but it could have been much, much, much worse. But the story of this game, unfortunately, or at least one of the stories, was the officiating. And there were 3 massive game-changing plays that completely altered the outcome of this game. And the reason I bring up Ohio State's quick start is because the first one came when Clemson was down 16-0, Ohio State up 16-0, and it was, of course, the big targeting penalty. And so, obviously, again, I know you guys all saw the game, so I'm not going to do that whole thing, but Ohio State's up 16-0. It's the middle of the second quarter. On a 3rd and 5, They blitz one of their cornerbacks, Shaun Wade, one of the best cornerbacks in all of college football. I think Todd McShay has him as a first-round draft pick. He hits Trevor Lawrence. He brings down Trevor Lawrence. Chase Young kind of wraps up at the same time, and Trevor Lawrence gets crumpled up like a pretzel. And at first they don't call anything, and Trevor Lawrence stayed down on the field. And I really do wonder if Trevor Lawrence's reaction led to the referees throwing a flag. But they eventually throw a flag, and they go to the booth to review targeting. And if you watch the game, by the letter of the law, this was technically targeting because Shaun Wade did lead with his helmet, but there is also some gray area in why this was a questionable call. And so I'm actually going to refer to a buddy of mine, Joel Klatt from Fox Sports, who frankly I actually hope to get on this show. He referenced this in a tweet, and this is why it's important. And I'm sorry, by the way, I just want to apologize in advance. I'm going to get into some mumbo-jumbo in talking about kind of rules and all that stuff, but I think it's important to explain in the context of this game. 3 big calls go against Ohio State. I don't think it's why they lost, but I do think it's important for us to kind of as a community, as an Torres Sports Podcast community, talk about these 3 calls, why they all went against Ohio State and what it meant for the game. And so the first one was the targeting call. And so again, if you watch the play, Shaun Wade did come in. Trevor Lawrence was kind of leaning forward, and Shaun Wade led with his helmet. And so because of it, Shaun Wade was eventually ejected from the game. I don't think it's a surprise that one of Ohio State's best corners gets ejected from the game. All of a sudden, Trevor Lawrence throws a touchdown pass a couple plays later to make it 16-7. But Joel Klatt brought up the interesting point of this. Was it technically the right call for targeting? By technicality, Shaun Wade's helmet did lead. It did hit Trevor Lawrence's helmet. But as Joel Klatt pointed out, when it comes to targeting, you need to confirm, and this has been a rule change with targeting over the last couple of years, because if you remember, it was basically the last couple of years, any helmet-to-helmet hit immediately led to an ejection. And so the point that Joel brought up was that in the new rules of targeting, and this came out over the summer, there's 3 or 4 things that go into what is actually targeting, and the referee's job is to confirm that all the elements of targeting are in place and did happen, and if any of them did not happen, then you should not eject the player. And so that was Joel's point. I actually, just for kind of the sake of kind of being smart on this podcast, I actually looked up what the official rulebook said. This comes straight from the New York Times on what qualifies for an ejection on targeting. And this from the New York Times. For targeting, officials will have to confirm every element of the call for a play to be penalized. If any component of targeting, like a player aiming at an opponent with the intent of attacking, is absent, the call on the field will be overturned. And so because of it, I think that this call could have been overturned, because I don't think that every element of targeting was there for Shaun Wade. I don't think it was malicious. I don't think it came with intent. You can argue if he really did lead with the crown of his helmet, because Trevor Lawrence kind of fell into him. And so I actually thought it was the wrong call to eject Shaun Wade from the game. The right call would have been to overturn the targeting call and to leave this kid in the game, because, again, the intent was not malicious, and so I had no big problem with it. It was unfortunate. You feel bad for Trevor Lawrence. You don't want him to get hurt. You don't want anything negative to happen to him, but you also have to be fair to the defender who was coming in on the blitz. You can't ask a kid running full speed to kind of stop or slow up when he's getting close to Trevor Lawrence, because Trevor Lawrence puts his head down. So that was the first big call that went against Ohio State, and the reason it was important is because immediately after that, Ohio State scored its first touchdown of the game. The second play, Ohio State is now up 16-14 coming out of halftime. Early in the second half, Ohio State with a 16-14 lead. J.K. Dobbins, the running back I just mentioned, he goes down with injury, and maybe that's why, maybe not, but Ohio State forces a punt and decides to go after the punt aggressively, basically to try to block the punt. They have 2 guys run into the punter, and there was a penalty there, but as we know, there are 2 different penalties when it comes to running into the punter. There's a 5-yard penalty when it's not malicious, and then there's a 15-yard penalty when we believe that there's an intent to injure the player. They could have given Ohio State the 5-yard penalty. They instead give him the 15-yard penalty, and again, I think it was the wrong call. I'll be honest. It doesn't mean that that's the reason that Ohio State lost the game, but you have to remember, this is, by the way, let me backtrack. The whole concept of roughing the punter is one of the most insane things in sports to me. And I tweeted about this. A lot of you agreed with me. But it is insane to me, the rules that we have in place for punters. And that's this, is that you can just short of murder a punter as long as your fingertip touches the ball. If 1/4 of 1 inch of your finger tips the ball on a punt block attempt, it's a clean play, and you can crush the punter and break his leg, and it doesn't matter because you got the ball. But if you miss by 1/4 of an inch, then all of a sudden it's a penalty, and it's 5 yards or it's 15 yards, and you can barely graze the kicker. It's insane to me. But either way, it was another example. It could have been a 5-yard penalty. If it was a 5-yard penalty, Ohio State would have gotten the ball back. Instead, the referees acted overzealous. It becomes a 15-yard penalty, and Ohio State scores after that. Finally, the last play, and this is the one that caused so much controversy for people who watch the game, is that middle of the third quarter, Ohio State has now lost the lead to Clemson. Ohio State is trailing. There is a pass. Clemson has the ball. Trevor Lawrence passes the ball to Justin Ross. Justin Ross has the ball stripped by Ohio State, returned for a touchdown, and the play on the field is called a strip and score for a touchdown. And that is very important, and I actually think that's the right thing to do by the refs. The one thing you don't want to do if you're the refs is to blow the whistle, blow the play dead, say it was not a catch, and then go to video review and realize that it was a catch and that you just cost Ohio State points. So I actually think they did the right thing by deciding to call it a catch, strip, and Ohio State score on the field. The big problem was, of course, that they went to video replay, and what happened? They overturned the call. And this was the one. If you want to talk about targeting, the targeting call being the right call, I have no problem. If you want to talk about the roughing the punter should have been 15 instead of 5, I disagree, but I can see your argument. But this one, there is no argument, and here is why. It's because of the fact that it was called on the field. Remember this. It was called on the field a strip and a score by Ohio State. It was called a catch by Clemson, leading to the strip by Ohio State, which led to the touchdown. Remember, this is the important part, and this is the same as it is in the NFL, as it is in college. To overturn that call, you have to have indisputable video evidence. In other words, anytime a call is made on the field, you have to have indisputable video evidence to overturn that call. So as an example, with the targeting penalty with Shaun Wade, there wasn't indisputable video evidence to prove that he didn't target, so he was thrown out for targeting. Well, in this case, there wasn't indisputable video evidence to prove that Clemson's Justin Ross did not make a catch. Because remember, they called it a catch on the field. Then the ball was stripped. And what they did was they went to review and they called it an incomplete pass despite not having indisputable video evidence. And that was wrong. And there's no arguing it. There's absolutely no arguing it. Is that it was called a catch on the field and there was not indisputable video evidence. So if you want to say that you think that maybe it was a catch, but you're not positive or you're not sure, and like if you want to do that, that's fine. But remember, you need indisputable video evidence to prove that it was not a catch. It was not there. So that was one of, if not the single biggest plays of the game, because it literally took points off the board with Ohio State. So 3 calls go against Ohio State. I think all 3 of them were nonsense. All 3 of them led to either points on the board for Clemson or points coming off the board for Ohio State. And I'll tell you, I'll say this, is that I do feel bad for Ohio State fans today. I do feel like, they got the short end of the stick with the refs. But I would also say this. The refs aren't the reason that Ohio State lost the game. And so there's 2 different things. I think we have to talk about the calls going against Ohio State. I just spent 10 minutes doing it. But there is a difference between bad calls going against you and calls costing you a game, and I don't believe that those calls cost Ohio State the game. Because again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. Ohio State had so many chances to put points on the board early. So many chances to get touchdowns and ended up settling for field goals. 3 field goals in the first quarter and a half of the game that could have been touchdown drives. If you're up 21-0, it doesn't matter what the refs do. It doesn't matter that the touchdown that you strip and score and it's called the touchdown, then it's overturned. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Ohio State had so many chances early, and then I would add they had so many chances late. Let's not forget, with about 5 minutes to go, Ohio State actually regained the lead from Clemson. And what happens? Clemson gets the ball back. Trevor Lawrence drives the ball 94 yards in 4 plays, the length of the field, to score the go-ahead touchdown, what ended up being the game-winning touchdown, and Ohio State still got the ball back. And as we all know, Ohio State on the last possession of the game threw an interception. Justin Fields drops back. Chris Olave, the wide receiver, ran the wrong route. Justin Fields throws towards the end zone, and it is an interception. Clemson wins the game, seals it, and moves on to the national championship. So I think it's an interesting conversation coming out of that game because I do think that the refs, they certainly did not work in Ohio State's favor. But I don't think that you can say that the refs cost Ohio State the game. You know what cost Ohio State the game? Settling for field goals early when it could have been touchdowns, settling for or throwing an interception late, not being able to get the crucial stop. Those are what cost Ohio State late. As I said a minute ago, it actually reminds me a lot of the situation with the Rams and Saints from last year. If you remember last year's Rams-Saints game, it was almost identical, right? We all remember the Rams-Saints NFC Championship game when there was the late pass interference call against the Rams that should have been a pass interference, but it wasn't, and it's all sorts of crazy stuff and this and that. And the other thing, what people forget, the game still went to overtime. The Saints had a chance to win it in overtime, and they didn't. What people also forget, the Saints had a couple chances early in that game to put up points. They settled for field goals. And so that's my big takeaway with this Ohio State game, with the Ohio State-Clemson game. Very similar to Saints-Rams in that the refs cost Ohio State points. The refs cost Ohio State momentum. They cost Ohio State one of their best players. But the refs did not cost Ohio State the game. Ohio State lost the game because they settled for too many field goals early because of the fact that they had a chance late to stop Clemson with the lead. They couldn't do it. Then they got the ball back and could not drive the length of the field. Justin Fields throws the interception. So I think that that's the important part. Ohio State got screwed, but I came out of that game saying the better team won. The more deserving team won. Clemson was the more deserving team, and they deserved the victory in that one.